There's a kind of loyalty the world does not reward with medals or promotions. It does not come with a raise. It does not earn you a warm handshake from the people above you. It is the kind of loyalty that costs you everything, your comfort, your career, maybe your future, and asks for nothing back. Most people, when that moment arrives, find a way to look the other direction. They shuffle their feet. They remember their mortgage. They remember their children's school fees. They remember that silence, in palaces, is always the safer language. James Okafor was not most people. He never set out to be the man who said no to a queen. He never practiced the speech in the mirror or imagined the news headlines or rehearsed the expression he would hold on his face when the pressure came. He was a guard. He stood where he was told. He watched the doors he was assigned to watch. He followed protocol the way a craftsman follows the grain of wood. Not because someone was looking, but because that was simply what the work demanded. What happened on that Tuesday afternoon in the east corridor of the palace will be debated for years. Some people would call it insubordination. Others would call it the finest thing they had ever witnessed in uniform. The palace would issue no official comment. The Queen Consort's office would deny the specifics. James Okafor would return to his post the following morning, stand at his door, and say nothing to the cameras that had gathered outside the gates. But the people who were there, the junior staff, the cleaning crew, the 200 guards who stood close enough to hear every word, they knew what they saw. They saw a man choose integrity over instinct. And it started the way most consequential things do, with something that looked completely ordinary. James had served the royal household for 11 years. He came in through the standard route. Military background, clean record, a physical fitness score that made the recruitment officer circle it twice, and ask if he'd written it correctly. He was not flashy. He did not socialize much with the other guards during shift changes, though he was not unfriendly. He brought his own food in a blue thermal flask, drank his coffee without sugar, and remembered the names of the cleaning staff on every floor he was ever assigned to. That last detail mattered more than it sounds. In a palace, the invisible people see everything. The ones pushing the carts, the ones collecting the bins, the ones who slip through service corridors like water through cracks. They're the ones who know where the real power moves, who is actually afraid of whom, which hallways carry tension on which days of the week. James had learned early on that if you wanted to understand any institution, any building, any household, you listened to the people everyone else ignored. He had spent his first 3 years assigned to the outer perimeter. Gate duty, visitor checks, the kind of work that tests your patience more than your judgment. He passed that test quietly. His 4th year brought him indoors, corridor assignments, function security during state events, protection detail for visiting dignitaries. By his 7th year, he had been elevated to a post that put him directly adjacent to the private residential wing. It was not glamorous. Most days nothing happened. He stood. He checked clearances. He nodded at the same faces walking the same paths at the same hours. The work was repetitive in the way a heartbeat is repetitive, so constant you stopped noticing it, but the moment it skipped, you felt it in your entire body. The residential wing operated on a clearance tier system. White clearance, blue clearance, red clearance. Each tier unlocked certain doors and corridors and access points. The system had been updated 3 years prior after a security review recommended tighter internal protocols. Every guard received the revised briefings. Every guard signed the updated acknowledgement forms. The tiers were not suggestions. They were not flexible based on mood or rank or personal authority. They were the structure inside the structure, the bones beneath everything else. James knew the system the way he knew his own handwriting. On the morning of what would become the most talked about day of his career, he arrived at his post at precisely 7:45. Signed in, did his corridor check, exchanged a brief word with Marcus, the overnight guard he was relieving, who mentioned that there had been a scheduling shift, a private engagement in the East Wing for the afternoon. Nothing unusual. Adjust for flow. Standard procedure. James noted it. Adjusted his mental map of the day. He had no reason to expect what was coming at him. She arrived at 2:12. He heard the footsteps first, The particular rhythm of heels on marble that carried authority in it, the kind of walk that expected corridors to clear. He recognized the sound before he saw the face. This was part of the training. Know the sounds. Know what they mean before your eyes confirm it. He turned. The Queen Consort moved through the east corridor with two members of her personal staff slightly behind her, both of them carrying that specific expression of people who are trying to look calm while watching something they know is about to go sideways. She was dressed formally, not the way she dressed for public engagements, but formally in the way palace insiders recognize, the kind of composed presentation that signals this visit was planned, deliberate, a point being made through appearance before a single word was spoken. She was heading toward the restricted access door, the one that required red clearance. James stepped forward, not aggressively, not with performance, the way he stepped forward for anyone, the way the job required. "Good afternoon," he said. "May I verify your clearance for this section?" The woman who would later be described in 3 separate news reports as visibly displeased looked at him the way people look at a turnstile that refuses to open. "You know who I am," she said. "Yes, ma'am," James said. "Ido." He did not move from the door. One of the staff members behind her shifted slightly. The other looked at the floor. "Then you understand," she said, "that I have business in this wing." "I understand that, ma'am. I'll need to verify the clearance before I can open this corridor." There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that fills itself with everything being left unsaid. "This is unnecessary," she said. "It's protocol," James said. "For everyone." The word everyone landed in the space between them, like something dropped from a height. He had not raised his voice, had not changed his posture, had not allowed the expression on his face to shift 1 degree in any direction. But everyone was a sentence all on its own. Everyone, including you, including this title, including everything standing behind those eyes right now. Her staff member, the one who had been looking at the floor, made a small movement. Reached for something. James clocked it. "If there's been an authorization issued today, I'll need to see it through the standard channel," James said. "I can contact the security desk and have the clearance confirmed in a few minutes." "A few minutes," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." The temperature of the corridor changed. Not literally, but anyone standing in it would have felt the shift, the pressure of a moment deciding what it was going to be. She looked at him, really looked. The kind of look that is also a test, that is searching for the crack, the flinch, the slight softening that tells you the wall will eventually move if you push it the right way. James Okafor did not flinch. What people later try to understand, reporters, commentators, the palace insiders who spoke anonymously to anyone with a notepad, was what James had been thinking in that moment. Whether he had been afraid, whether he had calculated the cost and decided he could afford it, whether there had been some philosophical framework operating behind those steady eyes. He was asked this, eventually, by someone who had gotten close enough to put the question to him directly. His answer was short. He said he had not been thinking about any of it. He had been thinking about the door. The door was his responsibility. The clearance system existed for reasons that were above his pay grade, and also, crucially, not his concern to evaluate in the moment. His concern was the door. His concern was the protocol. His concern was the fact that he had signed a form that said he understood his responsibilities, and that form did not have a clause that read, "except when the person in front of you carries enough authority to make your hands feel unsteady." He was thinking about the door. That was it. That was the whole of it. The standoff lasted 11 minutes. Later, that number would be repeated often, 11 minutes, as though there was something symbolic in it, as though the universe had chosen a prime number for this particular test of character. In reality, it was 11 minutes because that is how long it took for the clearance issue to move through the correct channels and come back confirmed or not confirmed, depending on which version of events you believed, since the palace never officially clarified what the authorization had actually shown. What is known, because the corridor had security cameras and because those camera logs were reviewed by 3 separate people who later described what they showed as this. James Okafor stood in front of that door for 11 minutes. He did not step aside. He did not waver. He did not look at his shoes or at the walls, or at anything except the situation in front of him with the same measured, unreadable attention he brought to every other moment of every other shift. At some point during those 11 minutes, a senior member of the household staff arrived. There was a brief conversation. James responded to questions. Then, the senior staff member made a call. Then, there was another wait. Then, the corridor visit did not proceed. The Queen Consort turned and walked back the way she had come. Her staff fell in behind her. No one said anything. The heels on the marble retreated until the corridor was quiet again. James turned back to his post. He stood at the door. He continued his shift. A junior guard named Thomas, who had been stationed further down the corridor and had watched the entire thing from a distance close enough to see, but far enough to stay out of it, would later tell a friend that the most remarkable thing about the whole 11 minutes was that James had never once looked like he was doing anything remarkable. He had looked, Thomas said, like a man doing his job, which of course was exactly what he was doing. The question that would keep people talking for months, was why that looked so extraordinary. And the answer to that, the real one, lived in the 11 years of smaller moments that had built a man capable of 11 minutes of that kind of stillness. Those moments were coming next. The days after the corridor incident moved the way oil moves through water, slow on the surface, but underneath, separating everything it touched. James returned to his post the next morning at 7:45, the same as always. He signed in. He did his corridor check. He drank his coffee from the blue thermal flask without sugar. He nodded at the cleaning staff. He stood at his door. If he had expected silence, he got something that was almost silence, but not quite. The kind of almost silence that hums, that has texture to it. The kind you feel at the back of your neck before you can name what's wrong. His colleagues were careful with him in the way people are careful with someone who has touched something they all knew was hot. Not cold, not unfriendly. Careful. The conversations were normal in topic and slightly off in duration, ending one beat too soon, pivoting 1 degree too quickly. People who had previously stopped to lean against the wall and talk for 6 or 7 minutes now managed 3. He noticed. He said nothing about noticing. Thomas, the junior guard from the corridor, did not manage the same careful distance as everyone else. Thomas was 23 and had not yet learned the survival skill of pretending not to have seen things you had absolutely seen. He found James during a shift overlap on the second morning and stood beside him for a long moment without speaking, which was itself a statement. "You good?" Thomas finally asked. "Fine," James said, because it was Thomas started, then stopped, reassembled. That was something. It was a clearance check, James said. Thomas looked at him the way young people look at someone they're deciding whether to believe or simply admire. He chose admire. He walked back to his post. The administrative side of the incident arrived on day 4 in the form of a meeting request, not a disciplinary summons. The language was careful about that, precise in the way language becomes when someone has reviewed it multiple times before sending. A meeting to discuss the East Corridor situation with Deputy Director Harmon. James read the email twice, not because he needed to read it twice, because he wanted to be sure he had read it correctly once. He had. He replied to confirm his attendance and went back to work. Deputy Director Harmon was the kind of man who had risen through institutional ranks by being excellent at understanding which way the wind was blowing and positioning himself so that it always appeared to be blowing in his direction. He was not corrupt, exactly. He was pragmatic in the specific way that institutions breed. A man who had learned to separate personal ethics from professional function so thoroughly that he had probably forgotten there had ever been a scene between them. He was also, in his way, not unkind. He shook James's hand when James entered the office. He gestured to the chair across the desk. He offered water, which James declined. Then he sat down and put both hands flat on the desk in front of him, which was his tell, his body signaling that what was coming had weight. "I want to start," Harmon said, "by saying that nobody is here to question your dedication to protocol." James waited. "The clearance system is the clearance system," Harmon continued. "You followed procedure. That's what you're supposed to do. Nobody in this building is going to stand in front of you and tell you that you did the wrong thing procedurally. The The word procedurally was doing a lot of work in that sentence. James could feel it. But, Harmon said, there it was. There are layers to this institution that go above procedure. You understand that. 11 years, you understand that. There are relationships. There are dynamics. There are situations where strict adherence to protocol, while technically correct, can create friction in areas that, in the bigger picture, cost us more than the situation was worth. James listened to all of this without moving. No one is blaming you, Harmon said again. I know, James said. Harmon seemed slightly wrong-footed by that. He had prepared for defensiveness, or perhaps for some version of contrition, and James had given him neither. You know, Harmon repeated. I followed protocol, James said. That's the job. If the protocol is wrong, the protocol should be changed. I'll apply whatever the updated protocol says. Harmon studied him. You're not worried about where this lands? I'm not going to pretend I followed the wrong protocol and apologize for it. James said, if that's what this meeting is asking for, I can't give it. The office was very quiet. Harmon picked up his pen, put it down, picked it up again. Nobody's asking for an apology, he said finally. Good, James said. What no one in that room said, what hummed beneath every word like the corridor's almost silence, was that the meeting had been requested not by Harmon's own inclination, but by pressure from above, from considerably above, that someone, somewhere in the layered architecture of palace hierarchy, had wanted James called in, reviewed, given the opportunity to soften his position retroactively, to offer something that could be used to smooth the friction Harmon had described. James had offered nothing. He left the office at the same time he had entered it, with nothing changed except the understanding, on both sides of the desk, of exactly who he was. The story might have stayed internal, if not for a woman named Diana Okeke. Diana was a senior palace administrator, mid-50s, 27 years in the institution, the kind of woman who had outlasted 3 changes of senior leadership by being indispensable in exactly the right ways. She was also the person who had authorized the East Wing clearance review protocols 3 years prior. Her name was on the updated briefing documents. Her signature was on the acknowledgement forms, including the one James had signed. She heard about the corridor incident from 2 different people within 12 hours of it happening. She reviewed the camera logs herself. She read the incident report that had been filed, a brief document, factual, neutral in tone. She sat with all of it for a day. Then, she did something that surprised even the people who knew her well. She went to find James Okafor. Not formally, not with a meeting request or a calendar invite. She walked to the East Corridor during his shift with no staff accompanying her, and she stood beside him the way Thomas had stood beside him. Near enough for conversation, far enough to give him the choice of whether to have it. You don't know who I am, she said. I know who you are, James said. Diana Okeke, Senior Administration. She looked at him. Then, you know my name is on those protocol forms. Yes. I came to tell you, she said, that what you did was correct. James looked at her. This was the first time since the incident that anyone above him in the chain had said those words in that order. I know, he said. She almost smiled. You knew before I told you. Yes. And it didn't matter. It matters, he said. But not for the reason people think. I didn't stand at that door because I thought someone above me would eventually validate it. I stood there because it was the right thing to do whether anyone validated it or not. Diana Okeke was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is actually a form of paying attention. Do you know what that is? She said. He waited. Rare, she said. That's what that is. The outside world found out, as the outside world always does eventually, through the gap between what institutions say and what the people inside them can't stop talking about. A journalist named Priya Mehta, who covered royal affairs for a mid-sized publication that specialized in institutional stories rather than gossip, received a message from an anonymous source that described, in careful language, the outline of what had happened. No names, no specific dates, the outline only. She spent 3 weeks verifying it through 4 separate sources before she published a single word. The piece, when it ran, used no names and identified no specific parties. It described a palace security guard who had refused access to a senior royal figure without proper clearance authorization, had held his position through direct pressure, had attended a subsequent administrative review, and refused to offer the expected concession, and had continued in his post without incident. The piece was 500 words long. It was read by approximately 900,000 people in the first 48 hours. The response to it was not uniform. There were people who read it and felt something settle in their chest, a recognition, a memory of every time they had been on the wrong side of that corridor, watching someone bend when they should have held. There were people who read it and were irritated, who felt that protocol and hierarchy were separate things, and this guard had confused the two. There were people who didn't care about the palace specifically, but who shared the article because it felt like something they needed in their feed that week, something that looked like proof that the right thing was still occasionally done. Inside the palace, the article produced a very specific kind of silence. The kind that means everyone has read it. James was told about the article by Thomas, who had read it on his phone during a break, and come to find James with the expression of someone delivering news he wasn't sure how to categorize. "That's about you," Thomas said. "Probably," James said. "How do you feel about it?" James considered the question with the same attention he gave to everything. "It's accurate," he said. "The thing happened the way it happened. People can read it however they want." Thomas looked at him. That's it. You're not, I don't know, nervous? Proud? Something." James picked up his flask, took a drink of his cold coffee. "I went home that evening," he said, "the same way I go home every evening. Made dinner, watched something, went to sleep. The next morning I came back and stood at this door." He looked at the door. What was there to feel? Thomas had no answer for that. Neither really did anyone else. What the article did not capture, what 500 words could not hold, was the texture of those weeks following the incident. The way the institution moved around James like water around a stone. The quiet recalibrations happening in offices he would never enter, about a man who had turned out to be more load-bearing than anyone had quite realized. Because the thing about institutional systems is that they depend on a certain amount of predictable flexibility from the people inside them. They need the guard to be reliable and also, occasionally, bendable. They need people who understand that there's the written rule, and then there's the applied rule, and that knowing when to apply which version is a form of social intelligence, a form of getting along, a form of belonging to the thing you work inside. James had turned out to be entirely reliable and not remotely bendable. That combination, in a palace, in an institution, in any structure built on the quiet management of human variability, was more disruptive than anything loud would have been. A loud confrontation could be managed, could be disciplined or dismissed or absorbed. A man who simply did his job precisely and completely with no drama and no deviation was a different kind of problem. He was, in the most uncomfortable way possible, correct. And in places built on hierarchy, correctness that ignores hierarchy is its own category of revolutionary act. James Okafor was not a revolutionary. He would have rejected the word with the same quiet certainty with which he had rejected every other framing the situation offered him. He was a guard. He stood at a door. He did not open it for people who did not have clearance. The consequences of that, in all their complicated institutional weight, were only just beginning to land. 6 weeks after the corridor incident, James Okafor received a reassignment notice. It came in the same format as all administrative communications. Clean letterhead, measured language, the careful grammar of institutions that want to sound neutral while doing something that is not. He was being moved. Not out, not down exactly, sideways. A post in the outer administrative wing. Shorter operating hours. Fewer direct interactions with the residential section. The notice described it as a scheduling optimization. He read it once, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. He told no one. He did not tell Thomas, who would have been outraged in the specific bright-eyed way of someone still young enough to find outrage energizing rather than exhausting. He did not tell Diana Okeke, though he suspected she already knew. She had a way of knowing things before the paperwork arrived to announce them. He did not post anything, say anything, perform anything. He put in his scheduled shifts for the remaining 2 weeks on his current assignment. He stood at his door. He verified clearances. He drank his cold coffee. He nodded at the cleaning staff. On his last day on the East Corridor post, Marcus, the overnight guard he had been relieving for the past 4 years, showed up 11 minutes early for no reason he offered an explanation for. He stood beside James in the corridor as the shift ended. They looked at the door together. "Good door," Marcus said eventually. "Good door," James agreed. Marcus left. James signed out. The reassignment notice had been drafted, though this was never confirmed officially, in the week following a private communication between Palace administration and the Office of the Queen Consort's household management. The specific content of that communication was never made public. What was known, through the layered, indirect channels through which these things always became known, was that the meeting between Deputy Director Harmon and James Okafor had been reviewed by people above Harmon, and that the outcome of that review had been considered unsatisfactory. James had not apologized. James had not adjusted his position. James had not provided the institutional face-saving that the situation had called for. The reassignment was the response. It was not framed as punishment. It never would be, because punishing a man for correctly following protocol was not something an institution could do on paper without the paper becoming a liability. So it was a scheduling optimization. It was a resource allocation adjustment. It was the kind of thing that happened all the time, the kind that left no fingerprints, the kind that asked the person on the receiving end to understand, without anyone being crass enough to say it directly, what it meant and what it was for. James understood perfectly. He reported to his new post on Monday morning. What happened next is the part of the story that no one fully anticipated, including James himself. The Priya Mehta article had been read by 900,000 people. It had also been read by a woman named Christine Aldrich, who ran a nonprofit organization that documented institutional accountability failures and recognized in the 500-word piece the shape of something she had been collecting for years. Christine reached out to Priya. Priya, who had been careful with her source and careful with her words and careful with everything about the piece, was also a journalist. And a journalist who sees her 500-word story growing legs is not a journalist who puts her notepad away. They did not contact James directly. They built the story around the story, the administrative patterns, the reassignment timelines, the institutional response protocols to incidents of this type. They pulled public records. They talked to people who worked in and around similar institutions. They built a picture that was not about James Okafor specifically, but about what happens in these structures to the people who choose the protocol over the pressure. The second piece ran 8 weeks after the first. It was 2,000 words long. It was read by 3 million people. Inside the palace, the second article was a different kind of silence. The first had been the silence of everyone having read something. The second was the silence of everyone realizing that the thing they had hoped would settle had not settled, had in fact become its own weather system, with its own momentum, pulling more material into it every day. Harmon requested a second meeting with James. This one was different in temperature from a first. Less careful, less managed. There was no offered water, no hands flat on the desk. Harmon sat with his jacket still on, which was not his usual office habit, and looked at James with an expression James had not seen on him before. It was close to respect. "Did you talk to anyone?" Harmon asked. "No," James said. Harmon looked at him. "I didn't," James said. "I have nothing to add to whatever is being written. I did my job. People are drawing their own conclusions. They usually do." Harmon rubbed the side of his face. "This is becoming a significant situation. I know. For the institution. I know. For you," Harmon said, and the way he said it made it clear he was not offering a threat. He was offering, perhaps for the first time in this entire sequence, something that was actually an honest assessment. James looked at him steadily. "I'm in the administrative wing now. What else is there to do to me that hasn't been done?" Harmon didn't answer that. "I'm not trying to create problems," James said. "I never was. I stood at a door. I did what the protocol said. If the institution wants me to believe I did something wrong, I can't help them believe that. I don't believe it myself." Harmon was quiet for a long moment. "Neither do I," he said. The sentence arrived quietly and sat between them with more weight than anything else that had been said in either meeting. James looked at the man across the desk, this careful, pragmatic, wind-reading man, and saw briefly what Harmon looked like when he stopped performing the role and just talked. Tired, mostly. Then, what do you want from me? James asked. Nothing, Harmon said. I just wanted you to know. For whatever it's worth. It was worth something. James acknowledged it with a nod. He left the office. Diana Okeke came to see him again at his new post, the administrative wing, quieter, fewer marble corridors, the particular low-key drone of office ventilation replacing the high-ceiling acoustics of the residential section. She found him at a checkpoint near the filing department, which was not the corridor assignment he had spent 4 years perfecting, but which he had made his own in the same quiet way he made everything his own. She stood beside him. You know what they expected? She said. Yes, he said. They expected you to be frustrated. To show it somewhere. Give them something to work with. I know. You haven't. No. She was quiet for a moment. The ventilation hummed. Someone pushed a cart past them in the distance. The article, she said. The second one. The accountability piece. I saw it. It's changing something, she said. I don't know yet what. But something is moving. She paused. Internal reviews are being requested. The clearance tier protocols are being examined by a working group. There's talk about how reassignment is used. James took this in. That's not because of me, he said. It's because of what you did. Those are different things, he said. She looked at him, considered, decided he was right. They are, she said. Yes. 3 months after the corridor incident, James received a formal review. This was not unusual. Reviews happened on a rolling annual cycle. But the timing of this one and the composition of the review panel was unusual. 3 members rather than the standard 2. Diana Okeke was one of them. The other 2 were from the security oversight body, one internal, one external. James sat in front of them and answered questions for 45 minutes. The questions were thorough. They covered the incident itself, his decision-making process, his understanding of the clearance protocols, his subsequent administrative meetings, his current performance in the reassigned post, his professional record across 11 years. His answers were consistent, direct, undecorated. At the end, the external reviewer, a woman James had not met before, with the specific composure of someone who had reviewed a great many institutions and been surprised by very few of them, looked at her notes for a moment before looking up. In your professional opinion, she said, was the reassignment a consequence of the corridor incident? The room was very still. James did not rush his answer. In my professional opinion, he said, the corridor incident was handled correctly. The reassignment happened. I can't speak to its causes because I was not present in the conversations that led to it. He paused, but the timing was not ambiguous. The external reviewer wrote something in her notes. The review concluded. 6 weeks later, James was reinstated to the residential wing. The notice used different language than the reassignment notice. It described a restructuring of the East Corridor staffing allocation. It described his demonstrated excellence in protocol adherence. It described his seniority and record in terms that had not appeared in any palace communication directed at him since the incident. He read it once, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. He told Thomas, who made a sound that was approximately 80% triumph and 20% relief, and then immediately tried to look composed. He thanked Diana Okeke in a message that was 4 lines long, the last of which said simply, "Thank you for standing in the corridor." She wrote back 2 words, "Good door." On his first morning back, James arrived at his post at 7:45. He signed in. He did his corridor check. He nodded at the cleaning staff, Hannah, who had worked nights for 9 years and who said welcome back without looking up from her cart, which was how James preferred things. He stood at his door. He drank his cold coffee. The corridor had the same marble acoustics, the same quality of light in the early morning that made the walls look like they were made of something older than stone, the same distant sounds of the institution breathing around him, carts moving, doors opening and closing, the measured footsteps of people with places to be. He was not the same person who had stood at this door before the incident. not in any obvious way. He would not have been able to identify the difference if asked to name it. But something had been confirmed about himself that he had always known, but never been required to test at cost. He knew now that the cost had arrived, and he had paid it without losing the thing the cost was meant to take. That was worth knowing. It changed nothing about how he stood. It changed everything about why. The story of James Okafor and the East Corridor did not end with headlines or a resignation or a formal public statement from anyone involved. Institutions are not built for those kinds of endings. They absorb. They adjust. They continue. The Clearance Tier Review produced updated guidelines, a small thing, a practical thing, the kind of bureaucratic outcome that gets filed in binders and training manuals and shapes hundreds of small decisions over years without anyone tracking it back to the moment it began. James's name was not in those guidelines. It didn't need to be. Priya Mehta wrote a third piece 18 months later about institutional accountability reform in hierarchical organizations. She mentioned the palace incident in a single paragraph, anonymized, as one example among 7. She called it a case study in what protocol adherence costs the individual and produces for the system. James never read it. He was on shift. Thomas was eventually promoted to a corridor assignment of his own. On his first morning, he found a blue thermal flask on his sign-in desk with no note attached. He knew who had left it. He filled it with coffee. He drank it without sugar. It took him 4 months to get the ratio right. What a palace standoff between a guard and a queen consort teaches us, if it teaches us anything beyond itself, is not about palaces or queens or guards. It is about the thin, load-bearing thing that runs underneath every institution, every hierarchy, every room where power and protocol and human beings occupy the same air. It is about what happens when one person decides that the right thing is the right thing regardless of who is watching, regardless of who is asking, regardless of what it costs in the short term to stand in a corridor and not open a door. Most people never get an 11-minute test. They get smaller ones, daily ones, the meeting where no one disagrees with the wrong decision, the email they write that says what they're expected to say rather than what they know. The door they open because the person asking is too important and the moment is too uncomfortable and the protocol is just a protocol and who really counts this stuff anyway? James Okafor counted it. Not because he was extraordinary, not because he had been built in some special furnace and come out harder than everyone else, because he had decided somewhere in 11 years of standing at doors that the work was the work, that it meant what it meant regardless of who was watching. That a form with his signature on it was not a formality. It was a commitment, and commitments were not flexible based on the pressure of the moment they were tested in. He stood at his door the morning of his return, and every morning after that, the same way he had always stood. Quiet, present, immovable, a wall that catches rather than blocks. That was the whole of it. That was enough.